질문을 뜨겁게 무슨 질문이 받든지 좋으니까 뭐 여기에 있는 말이 도대체 무슨 말이냐 뭐 신텍스부터 시작을 해가지고 뭐든지 질문을 하시고 뭐 용어에 대해서도 좋고 구약에 대해서도 좋고 해석에 대해서도 좋고 무엇이든지 좋으니까 이야기를 해주시고 It is our special privilege to have Professor this morning. He became my special friend last couple of days, and I think our friendship will continue in the future. In our ministry in China or perhaps and in the globe. And in Canada. This morning he urged me to translate my article on 다산 정약용 and bring it choice to publish. I think he was very much impressed to hear about Korean political philosopher and theologian and exegete to get to know in the West. And we will have a discussion after his lecture. Okay, let's encourage him with big hands.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I'm very glad to be with you here in South Korea. And of course, today I get to do most of the speaking, but I would prefer that you were doing most of the speaking, because I've come to Korea to learn rather than just to teach. And already through my friends here, I've learned a great deal, and especially about, I'm very, very excited about a philosopher called T. Mountain. So I think
this is a T. Mountain.
Okay. So, and you know, today I want to speak to you on how to read the book of Job. And so you've got the paper, but I just would like you to think a little bit as we go to this paper. And you know, one of my favorite philosophers is Søren Kierkegaard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've heard of Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher.
Sure, Kierkegaard.
Okay, but in his book, he wrote a book called Either Or.
Mm-hmm.
What is the title of that in Korean? Do you know? Either Or? Anyway, in that book, he talks about Job, and he says, how could I live without Job? He says, in the midst of my struggles, I take the book of Job and I read it out loud as though I'm shouting, and I take it to bed with me. And he says, I don't just, study Job. I take the book of Job and I put it on my heart. And see, I think that's what Scripture is for. And I think one of the things we must be very careful of at seminary, when I went to seminary in South Africa, I think my relationship with God was better before I went to seminary than when I came out of seminary. So before I went to seminary, my relationship with God was very existential. When I came out of seminary, big head, smaller heart. And what we want is big head, bigger heart. And so that's the sort of thing. Now, on the introduction, Brevard Childs, who is, of course, the father of canonical criticism, and I never knew him well, but I had several meetings with him, and he was, I liked him very, very much. He was a wonderful person. He's one of the few scholars that I've met who would always want to talk to me and say, Craig, where do we find the best Reformed preaching today? So Charles was not just a scholar, he was interested in scholarship that would help the church to hear what God is saying through the Bible. And that's the kind of scholarship I want to do. I want to do scholarship that enables the church to hear the power of a book like Job. I want people, when they have read my stuff, to feel like Kierkegaard, that in the midst of their struggles and their pains, they can take Job to bed at night with them and put him straight onto their heart, rather than worrying about whether that Hebrew word has that exact meaning. That is important, but in the service of listening to Job. So I will move through this fairly quickly, so I'm hoping that we have good time for discussion, because that's what I'm really interested in. So Brevard Childs was once asked by a student how he could become a better student, a better exegete of the Bible. And Brevard Childs replied, become a deeper person. There are few biblical books of which this is so true as Job. Job is acknowledged as great literature, but in Old Testament studies, especially under historical criticism, Job is understood to represent a crisis for the act-consequence theology of Proverbs, and its unity is contested. And see, this is what we struggle with as evangelicals, that historical criticism has done major work on Job, but it really prevents us from approaching Job to listen to what God is saying to us through Job. And my concern with evangelical scholarship is that it has spent most of the last 100 years trying to respond to historical criticism. Now, that's important, but I think we've got to move beyond that. We can't keep letting liberals tell us where we must do our work. We need to let the gospel tell us where to do our work in Old Testament studies, is what I would argue. So I think to see Job as a crisis in the type of wisdom we find in Proverbs is quite wrong. And I think if you read Proverbs carefully, you will discover that it is already aware that biblical wisdom can lead us into times of profound crisis. So Proverbs is as aware as Job and Ecclesiastes that wisdom is not a simple technique that you learn and then you've got it. It would be so nice if that was true. But what you will, many of you, although you are much younger than me, many of you will already have discovered that being a Christian does not exempt you from the agonies of life. And sometimes becoming a Christian will lead you into suffering, which you might have avoided if you had not become a Christian. And we need to, I think, recover a sense of the role of suffering in the Christian life. And especially in the West, I don't know what it is like in South Korea, but in the West, we're not very good with suffering. We think suffering must be put under the carpet as quickly as possible. Someone else must sort out the dirt. And in our churches, we don't deal well with dirt and mess. But the wisdom, one of the great insights, especially when you find, as I think you will, that at some point your life will be in a mess. And you may say, now where is God in this? The book of Job is there to remind us, as with Proverbs, God is in the middle of mess. And sometimes when we think God is most absent, St. John of the Cross, I don't know if you know the work of St. John of the Cross, but he wrote a very important book called The Dark Night of the Soul. And St. John of the Cross says, in the dark night of the soul, God's light is shining so brightly that we experience it as complete darkness. So these are tremendously important things. It's all here in Job, but I don't find it in the commentaries. So there's something wrong. So we've got to learn to read these books so that we can start to hear the depths of what God has to say to us and to humans. So I used to hold the view that Job and Ecclesiastes dealt with exceptions to the act or character consequence structure of Proverbs, but I have since come to the view that they do not deal with exceptions so much as with the formation that is involved in the production of truly wise people. Now, you know, here at Chongqing University and in the West, we believe that we will educate you here with the board, with all the technology, we will fill your heads, and then you will be very wise. No. You may be very knowledgeable, but there is a big difference between knowing a lot and being wise. And the book of Job and Ecclesiastes, I think, are there to remind us that spiritual formation is a very, very, very deep thing. And in the history of Christian spirituality, it almost always involves suffering. Now, I tell my students, and I would tell you, don't go looking for suffering. When it needs to, suffering will find you. There's enough suffering in the world. You don't need to go looking for it. But it will come. But when it comes, don't think God has gone on holiday. That's probably the time when God is doing the deepest work in your life. Now, Job as narrative art. Job is a very strange book in the Old Testament. Although Yahweh is the central character, all the human characters are not Israelites. So this is very funny. I can't, can you imagine reading the book of Job amongst God's covenant people? You know, it would be very funny. It would be like you do a course, and I don't know who is the enemy of South Korea. I don't know if you have any enemies, but let's say 40, 50 years ago, you read a book on wisdom, and apart from God, all the main characters are Japanese. You know, I think you would find this a hard book to read. It's that kind of book, you know. So, and then of course the other thing is, apart from a short prose framework and the conclusion, most of the chapters of this very, very long book, that's why most people don't read it, it's too long. You know, I mean, poetry, speeches, back and forth, all in poetry. There's very strange stuff. And this is to say nothing of the content of Job, the shuttling between heaven and earth in the open chapters, the Satan. Who is this figure, the Satan? We're not told. Now, from the New Testament, we can look back and I think correctly say this is the devil. But I wonder if you were an Israelite, what you thought, who is this figure of the Satan? The adversary is what that means. And then he doesn't appear again. I don't think. Some people think he does, but I don't think he appears again. And he is the one who catalyzes Job's suffering. And then you're so glad that Job is not alone. So his Japanese friends gather, and they sit with him for silence. Oh, I like that. I think we need to recover silence. I think, you know, living in Seoul, one is aware what a noisy context we live in. And of course, you are so used to it. that you probably don't know how noisy it is. And even I'm here for 2 days and it seems normal. It's not normal. It's full of noise. So they spend silence, but then these long speeches accusing him, misunderstanding him, and Job, has to go through this terrible agony. So Job, I think, if you want to read Job, you've got to read it as story. It is narrative art at its best. And so if you want to know what hermeneutic do you read the book of Job to hear it, I think you must read it as literature, as narrative, as story. Okay? Now that doesn't mean that it's not historical. There's evangelicals disagree on this. Is Job a record of what actually happened? Or is it something that is constructed and more fictional? And there's disagreement on that. And to be honest, I'm not terribly interested in that debate. I'm much more interested in how I can listen to hear the story with power. It's a bit like the book of Jonah. Okay, evangelicals spent most of the 20th century debating whether Jonah is historical or not. What they didn't do was attend to listening to the book of Jonah as narrative, and it is very powerful narrative. So the historical questions are important, but I think for Job, a literary hermeneutic is what you need. So let me just take you through some of the characteristics of Job as literature. First of all, the reader is given access to the opening scenes in heaven, but Job is not. So this is a very interesting thing, okay? So as a reader, you are allowed to see into heaven, but Job doesn't have that understanding. So this is the nature of literature. We know more than Job knows. And we are made aware of the challenge by the mysterious figure of the Satan as to the real motivation for Job's service of God. And this is such a very interesting question. Why does Job serve God? It's a very, very deep question. And in terms of Proverbs, what this does is it says, look, Job goes to church regularly. He's an elder in the church. He preaches very well. He tithes to the church. He's an excellent South Korean Christian. But why, in the depths of his being, does Job serve God? So you see what wisdom is doing. It's going right down to the very center of the person. Satan is raising that question. It is significant that Satan is given permission to inflict suffering on Job. And we won't discuss that. This is a hard question. This is the question of evil. In theology, we call this the question of theodicy. Question of theodicy. And it's important to note that the Satan is given permission to inflict suffering on God, but while the suffering is authorized or allowed by God, it does not come directly from God. And then I have a quote from Karl Barth. And one of the things to notice here is that there are clear boundaries within which Satan is allowed to afflict Job. Okay? Now those boundaries are fairly broad. Okay, so to kill his children, to take away his wealth, to inflict him with terrible disease, sores all over his body. These are not narrow boundaries. I mean, Satan is given a large room, but there are still boundaries. He's not allowed to do whatever he likes with Job. And that's something, by the way, to remember. When we go through suffering, or other people go through suffering, there are always boundaries. Because God is sovereign. In His own wisdom, He allows sometimes terrible suffering, but there are boundaries. So we must remember that. Now, chapter 1, verse 1 to 5, presents a picture of Job as the quintessential wise man. Now, many scholars disagree with me here, but I think the picture of Job is ironic. Okay, now, you know what irony is? That's where you say, oh, that man is so wise, he is the wisest in all the world. And what you actually mean, he's a fool. So you say something, but irony means you actually mean that you're implying something different. And my reading of 1:1 to 5 is that Job is portrayed as too wise. There's something obsessive going on. So, you know, he's presented as the quintessential wise person, but when his children are having their parties and their feastings, he has to go and sacrifice just in case. And I think what that indicates is that the most important thing for Job is not so much God as keeping his family together and in shape. So I think this obsessive concern for his children, in my view, what it indicates is that for Job, religion is his way of being sure that nothing will go wrong with his family. Okay? Very understandable, but I think in the Bible we would call this idolatry. So instead of religion being service of God, religion becomes the means for Job to control his world. And of course, what has to happen if Job is to grow? Job has to learn that he is not God, that he cannot control his world. See, that's the very painful thing. And wisdom, you know, as I have thought about this over the years, as I have lived my own pains and sufferings, the one thing, wisdom is really about allowing God to be God. But the very painful thing for human beings to learn is that if God is God, we cannot be God. We cannot control God. Wendell Berry, who's one of my favorite authors, he says, and I love this, he says, God is the wildest thing in the creation. Wild God. Uncontrollable God. God of fire and lightning. God of surprises. And if you think about us, we want a God that we can control. We want to be able to say, this is how God will work. We want to be able to say, if I go to church regularly, nothing bad will ever happen to my family. That's Job. But do you see what has happened? Instead of worshipping God, he's using God to make sure that his world obeys him. And that's what has to be shattered. Now, most of Job is poetry, and your professor, I think, has just written a book on poetry. This is very important. And I think we need to see why a book like Job on suffering is poetry. Because, you know, you can, if you're doing a course in theology, we could today have a lecture on theodicy. Here are the 7 different views amongst Christians about suffering. The free will view, the view that God is not all-powerful. You see what I mean? We could have a very academic discussion, but it wouldn't help us, I don't think, if we're in the midst of suffering. If you're in the midst of suffering, you need poetry, you need story. That's why Kierkegaard says, who suffered enormously, he says, when I go to bed at night, I take Job to bed with me. And he doesn't go under my pillow, straight on my heart. Not into the head, straight onto the deepest part of my being. And for that, poetry is uniquely required. And you can learn a lot about Job from the poetry. So the frames of the speeches have a certain type of poetry. And then, of course, the last speaker is the youngest, Elihu, and his poetry is more powerful than the friends. But as Robert Alter says, it does not soar like the voice from the whirlwind. And Job's poetry is a poetry of protest. And so it's poetry, I think, and art that enables the depth of tragedy to be evoked in the book of Job. And there's a whole discussion in philosophy about tragedy, and I have some discussion of that, which is probably not terribly important for you. But it's particularly when we come to the speeches of Job that the poetry soars like an eagle flying. And I once heard, there's a Jewish scholar in the West called George Steiner. And George Steiner is not a believer, not a Jewish believer, as far as I know. But when I heard him give a lecture, he said the following thing to us. He said, when he is sitting in his study, on a good day, he can imagine Shakespeare sitting and writing Shakespeare's plays. But he says he cannot imagine a human being writing these speeches of God. There is something about them that is truly divine. They come from God. And it's poetry. So, I wonder what your view of God is. Have you ever thought of God as a poet?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. You are allowed to shout Amen, Hallelujah, and such things in class. But God is a poet. There's one of my favorite philosophers starts one of his earliest books, God an author. Such humility. But here in Job, God is a poet. And the poetry is profound. And it deals with the things that Job is struggling with. Now, there is a discussion about whether the book of Job actually answers Job's problem. So Job wants to know why. Why has he had to suffer so much? And many Western scholars answer, this is a silly book, because it never answers his question. And I think they are silly scholars, because they don't listen very carefully. Because what the book of Job does, and I think this is very instructive for us in suffering, it doesn't answer the question that Job thinks is the question. It answers the question that God knows is Job's deepest problem. So at a head level, Job says, this is the answer I want. At a very different level, God says, this is the answer that you need. And so you see, this is very instructive for suffering. If you have suffered a lot, you will find yourself like Job saying, why? But often the answer to such suffering comes not through the intellect, but through encounter with God. And the answer comes at a very deep level in the heart, even if it never comes to the head. So that in a strange way, there's resolution, and there's growth, and hope returns, and somehow you come to peace with what has happened to you, although you may never be able to explain why it happened. And that's very important, because you're not God. See, always, the great human temptation is, we want to be God. We want to know like God. We should know like God. God has no right to treat us like this, because we know better than God. And wisdom is coming to a point where you are at rest as a creature who is very limited before this extraordinary Creator. And so I think the book of Job does answer Job's experiential crisis, but it doesn't give you an intellectual answer as we might expect. Now, I'm moving on now to why is Job such a long book? Okay, and I'm sure, I bet you if I asked you which is your favorite book in the Bible, I bet you not one of you would say Job. It's a bit like saying my favorite book is Leviticus. It's very strange, because it's just so long. So why is Job such a long book? And what I have come to see is that, and you find this in Ecclesiastes as well, is that it's because Job and Ecclesiastes are performative books. Now let me explain to you what I mean by this. In Ecclesiastes, Kohelet is struggling to find out if life is meaningful. That's his big struggle. Is there meaning in life? And so the book of Kohelet is a very difficult book to get a hold of. Just like the question of the meaning of life is for Kohelet. So the book performs the message of its book for the reader. So Kohelet is really struggling with what is life about. To understand Kohelet, you have to really struggle. That's the performative nature of the book. Now, if any of you go through deep suffering, you will discover one of the characteristics of depression, for example, and depression is one of the great diseases of our age. And I understand in South Korea, for example, that you have a very, very high suicide rate. So it's one of the ironies. You are such an advanced culture, and you have many, many people who think that life is no longer worth living. And don't think you won't experience that. If you are going to be a pastor, or you're going to help people in South Korea, some of you will have to go through that so that you can understand what it is like to suffer in this way. But one of the characteristics of depression is that you think it will never end. It feels as though it will never get better. There is no way out of this. It's going to carry on forever. And so Job carries on forever. We are lucky it's so short. It could cover the whole Bible. It could go on for miles and miles and miles. It's the performative nature of the book. That's what suffering is like. Endless conversations. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Thinking you've made progress, then you regress. Confessing, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord, followed by 38 chapters of misery and hell. It's the performative nature of the book. And so we've talked about how after a long wait, and here again there's lots to learn, suffering requires patience. And I would think that in Seoul, people are not very patient, because this is a very fast-moving city. Everything is very efficient. Suffering is never efficient. It completely defies the law of efficiency. It takes its own time. You can't rush it. You have to wait through it. Patience. See, and I think if God is at work in your lives and soul, one of the things He will do is slow you down. Because I don't think God is a lot of the time in the speed and the fastness of our Western cultures. I think God is found far more in the slowness and the stillness. And sometimes the only way we can recover that is through suffering. Because suffering forces you to stop. And then you're in a position where you can listen. And when you are slow and you're listening, do you know what happens? God speaks. It's very strange stuff. Okay, now, you know, the other thing, and I'll just say a few words about this, and then we can go on to a discussion, is I think the book of Job is a very good one to do a psychological reading of. And some of that I've already mentioned, so a psychological, spiritual formation reading. And now, please, the one thing you must be clear, there's a lot in the work of Jung that I don't like. So I'm not a Jungian, okay? And many evangelicals are very scared of Jung, and I understand that. But Jung is one of the very few major 20th century psychiatrists who took religion seriously. Do you know what Jung said in later life? He said he never had a patient who recovered without becoming religious. So Jung is one of the very few people in psychiatry and psychology who really takes religion seriously. And the big insight that I've drawn from Jung is that the process of transformation is one in which our ego, from being very inflated and thinking we are the center of the world, is transformed to take its place as a creature before God. And I think, in my opinion, this is a very simple thing, but very profound, that the heart of wisdom is the recognition that I am not God. And the truly wise person learns to live with God as God, and with myself as a creature, as a servant of God, and then do you know what happens then? You can really start to live life. It's a terrible strain trying to be God. We should, many of us in the evangelical world, we are trained to think we are God. We have to have all the answers. We have to fix every problem as a pastor. In our DNA, I found this as a pastor, that in our DNA we have a fix-it syndrome. So we think we are the answer to any problem in the church. We're the pastor, we're the big authority, we've trained at the university, we must fix every problem. And the only thing that will explode that is when we encounter something that we can't control. That's what happens to Job. And do you see the interesting thing with Job, it's what makes me so scared about God sometimes, that God knows exactly where to push the button. And do you know where it is? It's the area that Job protected above every other area. So Job could have coped with a lot, but not the family goal. That was the area religiously he protected, sacrificed, protect that area. God can do anything, but he mustn't be allowed to interfere with the family, because that's the most important thing to me in my life. And when God gets to work with Job, what does he go for? Bullseye is what we would call it, the family. And then, but you see that the end of it is Job is completely liberated to be Job. He doesn't have to be God anymore. He can allow God to be God, and then you are free to be a human person in the service of God. You can be yourself. You don't have to be God. You can recognize your limitations. You can celebrate that, and you become genuinely free. And I think what wisdom does, and this is a very, very important insight for me, is that wisdom enables us to become fully human. You know, when I became a Christian in South Africa, I was converted at the age of about 14. I found that the sort of evangelicalism I was converted into did not help me to become more fully myself. It made me fit into a box. So I'm an introvert. But all I was told all the time at the age of 14, you must be doing evangelism, you must be doing evangelism, you must be doing evangelism. But I was shy, introverted. And so, in a strange way, that type of Christianity closed down my humanity. And I think the Spirit, when the Spirit is at work, He opens up our humanity. And we become more fully ourselves. And then I discovered when you become more fully yourself, you don't have to force evangelism. Because then you're able to build friendships with all sorts of people, Christians and non-Christians. And they see something about you which is very human. And you know what happens then? It calls forth their questions. And I think this is what Peter says in his letter, that we need to be able to give a reason for the hope that is within us. It calls forth the questions because people see that we are human, that we suffer, that we are formed through our suffering, and it's a very attractive thing. They see something that calls to them, like honey for a bee, and then they ask the questions. And then we're able to say, I have suffered, I've done this, I've done that, and I have found God more deeply in this journey that I'm on. So I think the book of Job is a very important book. Yeah.
Oh, well done. Okay. Next week. 좀 이해하셨나요? 네. 어려움이 있었나요? 날 좀 보시고 땅만 보지 마시고 물도 한잔 하시고 기억해보려부터 시작했죠. 아이들 or 우리말로 번역을 하자면 이것이냐 저것이냐 저희 옛날 김준호 목사님께서 기억해보를 가져오시고 이것이냐 저것이냐 말씀을 많이 하셨는데 내가 프레이를 통해서 다시 기억해보를 듣게 된 거예요. 기억해보를 유혹기를 너무나 사랑했다. 그래서 침대에 들어갈 때도 유혹기를 끌고 들어가고 유혹기를 소리 내어서 읽고 샤우팅하고 그리고 이제 가슴에 안고서 이제 유혹기가 기억해보를 가장 깊은 그 존재 밑바닥까지 들어가기를 이제 원했다는 이야기. 그다음에 이제 그 BS 차일즈 이야기를 했는데 어느 학생이 차일즈 보고 우리가 어떻게 하면 좋은 주스가가 되겠냐 또 이렇게 물었더니 be a deeper person 더 깊이 내려가야 사람이 좀 더 깊어져라. 우리가 깊어지면 진짜 성경이 원하는 주석을 해줄 것이다. 그럼 이제 두 사람이 이야기로부터 시작을 해서 우리가 이제 유혹기로 들어갔는데 유혹기가 이제 스토리라는 것, 스토리도 또 시도, 네거티브와 포이트리를 통해서 이제 유혹기가 우리에게 다가오고 있는데 주제는 고난이고 고난을 통해서 우리가 이제 지혜를 얻게 되는 지식을 얻게 되는 것이 아니라 지혜를 얻게 되는데 고난이 오면 이제 뭐 우리가 깨어지니까 깨어질 수밖에 없으니까 우리 안에 어떤 그 변화가 일어날 수밖에 없겠죠. 물론 고난이 와도 변화를 거부하는 사람들이 있지만 고난을 받아들이게 될 때
우리 속에 이제 트랜스포메이션이 일어난다는 이야기를 요기를 통해서 해주고 있어요. 이제 여러 가지 이야기를 요기의 특징이 뭐 스토리라는 것, 스토리를 통해서 웨스턴 이야기를 해주는 것, 우리가 다 알고 있는 이야기들이죠. 그리고 이제 사단을 어떤 바운드, 아무리 우리에게 고난이 심하게 와도 아무리 그 고난의 범위가 넓어도 하는 그 바운더리를 두고 있기 때문에 우리는 그 가운데서 이제 위로를 받고 살 수 있다는 이야기. 그리고 이제 여기서 제일 재미있는 이야기는 아무래도 그 performative nature가 되죠. performative nature가 거기에 performative nature가 왜 여기가 이렇게 보면 performative nature를 우리나라 번역을 하자면 아무래도 수행적 성격이라고 할까? 어떻게 번역을 하는 좋겠어요? 퍼포먼하는 거예요. 퍼포먼하니까 뭐 실행하는 것이 있고 수행하는 것이 있고 이걸 이제 설명을 하기 위해서 우울증을 가져왔어요. 그죠? 한번 뭐 우리 모두가 지금 다 우울증에 걸릴 수가 있습니다. 우울증에 걸릴 수 있고 특히 여성들은 이제 한 아이들 다 키우고 이제 다 시집가고 장가가고 나면 empty nest에서 뭐 할 것도 이제 없고 해서 또 이제 호르몬의 성분들이 변화가 오고 그래서 이제 그 우울증에 걸리게 되고 자살을 하게 되고 그래서 우리나라가 지금 세계에서 가장 높은 자살률을 갖고 있죠. 그리고 그 자살 여러분들 교회에도 자살이 많은지 모르겠어요. 저도 개인적으로 우리 가족 가운데 가장 가까운 사람이 참 젊은 날에 자살을 해서 너무나 큰 충격을 받은 적이 있었는데 그런 일이 있을 것을 상상을 못했는데 이제 우울증 때문에 그렇게 되죠. 그 사람이 자살을 하게 된 게 꼭 뭐 어떤 스스로 하나님을 거역해서가 아니라 우울증에 걸리는 우리가 그쪽으로 들어갈 수밖에 없어요. 그러니까 자살하는 사람에 대해서 우리가 더 깊은 심리학적 이런 이해가 필요하다고 생각되어지는데 이제 우울증에 걸리는 이건 치료가 없고 끝이 없고 나아졌다가 또 악화되고 그렇게 되면 끝없이 이제 그 고난이 수행이 되는 거죠. 날도 끝없이 이렇게 쏟아내는 상처받은 사람을 한번 만나면 이 사람은 힘들 때마다 그 이야기를 하는 것 같아요. 왜냐하면 그 소리가 그만큼 길다는 거예요. 그걸 이제 노기가 우리에게 보여주고 있다는 그런 이야기. 그리고 이제 이런 요업들을 이해를 하기 위해서는 아무래도 우리가 사이코로지니까 좀 사이코로지컬 어프로치가 필요하고 우리가 요업들을 접근하는 데 있어서는 우리가 프로이드로 접근하기는 뭐 여러 가지 어려움이 있겠죠. 프로이드에게는 종교의 영역이 필요가 없으니까. 그래서 이제 유흥을 통해서 우리가 이제 요업들을 접근하게 되는데 저 역시 이제 유흥에 대해서 많이 읽었어요. 이제는 유흥의 전집이 나왔어요. 우리나라에도 유흥학회가 우리나라에 있고 우리가 이제 목회를 하려고 하면 심리적인 원형 심리에 대한 분석도 좀 필요하고 이해가 필요한데 유흥 이야기를 가져왔고 물론 이제 전학크레이그나 유흥파는 아니지만 유흥은 우리의 심리학에서 종교를 가지고 있는 유일한 사람 유일한 심리학자로서 유흥이 중요하죠. 중요하고 유흥의 개념 가운데 제일 중요한 게 셀프하고 에고하고 이제 에고는 우리의 의식적 자아예요. 사회적 자아이고 그 셀프는 불교에서 말하는 진아, genuine myself. 이게 이제 that is the essence of Buddhist practice of Zen, to find the genuine self. Even in Taoism. 그 이제 우리가 셀프를 찾아가는 것이 참된 나, 창조주 하나님이 나를 만들었을 때의 나. 그래서 예수님이 어린애가 되라는 그런 말씀드립니다. 이제 우리는 지금 다 에고밖에 몰라. 우리가 이제 이런 윤이나 사이코로지 트레이닝을 안 받다 보니까 우리는 자아가 너무나 강해. 그리고 막 내 자아가 상처가 될까 막 이렇게 고슴도치처럼 이렇게 다 튀겨지고 그러는데 이제 너무 부딪히게 되죠. 그게 우리 교단의 문화이기도 하는 것 같아요. 현재. 이제 이고 같은 것은 인플레이트 될 때도 너무 많고 뭐 잘한다 하는 거지 너무 인플레이트 될 때도 있고 너무 이제 위축될 때도 있고 그래서 우리 이 이고는 어쨌든 자꾸 내가 모든 걸 통제하려고 하는 좋은 엄마가 자식들을 모든 것들을 통제해서 좋게 불필요 받잖아요. 다 이제 내가 신이 되려고 하는 이제 목사들도 뭐 우리 교회 모든 문제들을 다 내가 풀어야 되고 그래 내가 어찌 보면 신이 되려고 하는데 결국은 우리는 신이 아니고 우리가 풀 수 있는 일들이 없고 이제 원하는 이제 보게 되고 그래서 그런 그 본을 통해서 우리가 이제 지혜를 찾게 되고 그 지혜의 목적은 이제 그거를 찾는 것, 내가 참 사람이 되는 것. 그러니까 우리 신앙의 목표가 진짜 인간, 진짜 내가 되는 것. In a sense, it is finding the imago Dei in ourselves. 우리 속에 있는 하나님의 형상이 recovery of imago Dei. 우리 자신은 항상 하나님의 형상을 찾아야 되는 이런 이제 스토리가 이렇게 나오고 이렇게 다양한 문화적인 특징들 이런 것들이 참 설명이 잘 된 것 같아요. 그래서 우리가 역사 비평하기 계속해서 제기하는 문제만 따라가려고 하다 보니까 우리가 성경을 못 읽어내려는 비평하게 되는 답변만 우리가 열심히 하다 보니까 결국 성경을 하나님 말씀으로서 내가 보지 못하고 나가는 데만 만나갈 것 같은 그래서 이 역사적이나 그것은 조나가 역사적이냐 이반젤리칼들은 그 역사성을 막 증명하기 위해서 막 이게 거품을 이제 내밀죠. 요나가 뭐 고래 뱃속에 들어갈 수 있다. 그래서 고래 목은 작은데 어떻게 들어가냐 큰 고래도 있다고 이런 병정 뭐 이런 것들인데 그런 것보다는 우리의 스피리추얼 안심 이것을 이제 그리스도 속에서 찾아가는 이런 거 목회적이고 또 신학적이고 또 학문적이고 이런 것들을 또 심리적이고 영적이고 하는 이런 많은 토론들을 이렇게 가져왔습니다. 굉장히 즐겁고 저도 참 많이 배우고 새로운 자리에서 이제 보게 되는 것 같아요. 나머지 내용들은 여러분들이 좀 읽어보시면 알 수 있을 것 같아요. 이제 let's have discussion. Any question is welcome.
교수님, 키에르케고리의 신학대성 통독자, 키에르케고리의 신학대성 통독자, 신학대성 그것이 지금 유혹기를 깊이 묵상해서 또 다른 영향이 있다는 것인가요?
The essence of Kierkegaard's philosophy is that to stand all alone as a single person before God can be the summary of Kierkegaard's philosophy, and if that is true, was it influenced by the Book of Job?
You know, I'm not sure that is. There's a lot of discussion about how to read Kierkegaard. And the important thing to understand is that Kierkegaard was living in Copenhagen in Denmark, and people in Denmark thought just because they were Danish, they were Christians. So they assumed, it's like saying we are South Korean, we've grown up in a Christian home, the culture is Christian, it's a bit different, therefore we're a Christian. And it's what I tell my students is like, in America they would call it the cookie jar. So a jar full of cookies, and then there's a mouse in the cookie jar. And the mouse looks around and it sees this cookie and that cookie, and it says, oh, I'm in the cookie jar, so I must be a cookie. But it's a mouse. So Kierkegaard was, his whole corpus of literature, which is very interesting, highly creative, is to try and make people work out for themselves what they believe. And so he has this statement that is often misunderstood. Truth is subjectivity. And what he means by that is you have to come to the truth yourself. You can't just rely on the culture and that sort of thing. So I think, so I don't think Kierkegaard is such an individualist as people sometimes think. But I do think Job is very influential on Kierkegaard.
이해하셨죠? 겔케골이 덴마크 코펜하겐에 살았는데 완전히 이제 기독교 문화 속에 살다 보니까 모든 사람들이 자신을 기독교인이라고 생각을 했어요. 마치 이제 쿠키죠. 이제 서양에 가면 이제 그 큰 병에다 이제 쿠키를 많이 넣어놓는데 그 안에 실제 이제 쥐가 있어서 그걸 다 먹고 있는데도 불구하고 우리는 그 쿠키자가 전부 내리시라고 생각을 하는 것처럼 안에서 쿠키는 다 이렇게 하나도 먹고 있는데도 여전히 쿠키라고 생각을 하는 것처럼 겔케골은 그래서 자신이 믿는 기독교 종교를 이제 말을 한 거죠. 그래서 you mentioned about the subjectivity. Or what
Truth
is subjectivity. Truth is subjectivity. 진리는 주관적인 것이다. 진리는 주관성이라고 말을 했는데 그것은 이제 그런 배경에서 나온 것이고 겔케골이 절대로 단독자라고 우리가 생각을 하는 것처럼 개인주의자는 아니었고 그리고 이제 여기에 영향을 받은 것은 사실이다. 네, 또 다른 질문 하시죠. 네, 영어로 하시죠. 해보시죠.
My name is Injo. I am writing my PhD dissertation about the Book of Job.
Oh.
We are very pleased to have you. Thank you for your lecture, and I am inspired by your insightful thoughts.
Thank
you. I'd like to ask a few questions, and two questions of it. First question is about the type of wisdom in the Book of Job.
What type of wisdom?
Yeah. You raised the issue that Job doesn't represent a crisis in proverbial wisdom, something like traditional wisdom, right? And meaning it's the act consequence theology, like retributive theology, isn't it? Yeah. But I think in Job there are many types of wisdom. For example, in Job there are speculative, or reflective, or experiential and practical, and creational wisdom, as well as traditional wisdom, depends on retributive wisdom, right? Retributive theology depends on. And I think these kinds of wisdom are beyond traditional wisdom. rather than involved in traditional wisdom.
Beyond the traditional.
Beyond traditional wisdom. So, do you think they are similar? They are similar to traditional wisdom or involved in traditional wisdom? I'm wondering what it exactly means that job doesn't represent a crisis in proverbial traditional wisdom.
Very good
Okay.
question.
And second question is about psychological reading of it. And in your conclusion,
There are only two questions.
and in your conclusion, you said proverb has far less gain from psychological reading. And proverb is not narrative, although it contains narrative. You said that.
Yes.
And if so, may I ask how different narrative is from narratives in job?
Right.
And I want to know what the meaning is. The job is narrative art. I'm very wondering.
Mm.
Thank you.
No. I think a very good question. I'm tempted to reply that Job is full of mystery and we cannot answer these questions because they're too difficult. So I think, first of all, I'm very glad you're working on Job. So well done. So that's a good choice and a hard book, you know. And then I really, really like your comment about different types of wisdom. So I think that's a good comment because I think there are many facets, or I think you might want to think of wisdom like a diamond, and it has many facets to it. Very careful. So I think you were getting at that wisdom is not a simple thing. It's not one thing, it's many things. There are many types of wisdom, so I do like that. Another image that we might want to use from New Testament scholars is that wisdom are like the pearls on a necklace. There are many pearls, okay? Now, but as a woman scholar said, only a man would think the pearls are not carefully arranged. Okay, so my question to you would be that I think there are many different types of wisdom, but how are they related to each other?
Just it is different. It is linked by traditional wisdom, I think.
Yes, well, and see, what I'm wanting to ask us to do is to rethink the nature of traditional wisdom. So I think you'll notice in the paper that I use the language character consequence motif rather than act consequence motif. So that's an important nuance of difference. And then also you'll notice that I start with a quote from Proverbs. The crucible is for silver and the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. And so what I'm wanting us to do, which I think is what you are doing, is to rethink what does the landscape of wisdom look like. It's not a simple thing. It's like pearls on a necklace. So here is the center pearl, but how are these other pearls related to it? So, and I think that's one thing that evangelical scholars need to do. And so, but you're quite right, so in Proverbs, for example, on the one hand, wisdom is available to everyone. Lady Wisdom is standing on the street shouting out to anyone who would listen. In Job 28, no one knows where wisdom is to be found. Now, is that a contradiction? Well, I think it's a different facet of the diamond. So I think if in your work you can help us to work out how these different elements relate to each other, I think that's a very helpful thing. You know, so I think that's my answer to the first question.
Yeah, we better finish here before we go into the second one.
Okay.
We should, I think, have time to reflect
On this
the
question.
first
Okay.
question. 첫 번째 질문 뭐 영어로 한번 해보실래요? 한번 요약해 주시겠어요? 방금 들으신 말씀.
Yes.
그 질문이 뭐냐 하면 욥기에 그 우리가 이 페이퍼 안에 욥기하고 잠언하고 사이하고 별 차이가 없다는 이런 이야기 다 인과응보시나 기원으로 깔려 있다는 것 때문에 이런 주장을 했기 때문에 이제 욥기에 나와 있는 지혜의 성격이 뭐냐 욥기 안에는 단지 응보 지혜만 있는 게 아니라 굉장히 그 추상적이고 또 사색적이고 또 철학적이고 또 우주적인 cosmological wisdom is in the book of Job.
But also in Proverbs.
Also in Proverbs 8.
Well, Proverbs 8, Proverbs 3. 3 and 8. See, that's my
That's
point.
what his answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it later. There are many animals in the book of Proverbs. Oh, okay. You may list several of them. Not like in the book of Job.
Yeah, no,
that there are a
that's
lot
true.
of-
That's true.
그래서 욥기에는 너무나 다양한 이런 지혜가 나오는데 이게 traditional wisdom하고 다르지 않냐. 이제 그동안에 이제 우리가 생각해 온 것은 욥기의 지혜하고 잠언의 지혜가 별 차이가 없다가 이제 일반적인 것이었어요. 그런데 이제 우리가 욥기를 볼수록 욥기와 잠언의 지혜가 다르다는 걸 인식했어요. 그래서 오랫동안 이제 크레이도 욥기 지혜하고 잠언 지혜가 다르다고 생각을 했는데 이제 이 단계에서는 욥기하고 잠언 지혜가 유사하다는 걸 이제 다시 봤어요. 물은 물이다, 산은 산이다 이러다가 물은 물이 아니다, 산은 산이 아니다 하다가 물은 역시 물이고 산은 역시 산이다 하는 대로 이제 갔어요. 갔는데 이제 이현정 선생님이 이제 같다는 점에서 크라이시스 후에 온 것이 욥기라고 하는데 그게 아니지 않느냐는 이제 이런 질문을 던졌습니다. 그래서 이제 답변은 또 아주 쉽게 다이아몬드의 여러 측면들이 여러 면들이 있는 것처럼 지혜를 여러 면 있고 그리고 진주 목걸이에도 여러 개의 진주가 있는 것처럼 지혜도 여러 개가 있다. 그러나 본질적으로 지혜의 성격은 유사하다. 그때 표준으로 이제 그 첫 페이지에 있는 은은 보관이에서 또 금은 풀무에서 나오지 않느냐. 지혜도 그렇다. 그러니까 그래서 크레이그가 이해하는 기본적인 그 지혜의 개념은 act consequence가 아니라 character consequence다. 그러니까 인과 응보는 기본적으로 행동인데 위약의 지혜는 행동으로 결과가 오는 것보다 인격, 성격, 인격에서 이렇게 행동이 만들어지는 것이다. 욥기는 잠언이 둘 다 인격 형성의 관심을 갖고 있다는 점에서 traditional wisdom이 다른 다양한 wisdom하고 어떻게 연결되어야 하는지에 대해서 좀 더 이제 생각하고 이렇게 답변을 하셨습니다. Are you satisfied with the first question? Before going into the second one?
But I didn't understand well character consequence. What is character consequence?
In comparison to active consequence.
Okay, well, so do you want to explain that?
Oh, you may do it because you are asked. I have explained a little bit, but she didn't buy it.
No. It sounds. I wish I understood Korean because then I could. So people have asked, what kind of wisdom do we find in Proverbs? And they've argued, as you said, a wisdom of retribution, where if you act in a certain way, certain consequences inevitably follow. Okay. And one of the things I'm trying to say is that is too simplistic. Okay, so for example, in Proverbs, Proverbs is quite aware that you can be very wise and still be poor. So Proverbs is far more complex than the simplistic act-consequence approach. And a better approach would be character. So character is the whole person, not just what I do, but what I am. See, character, what is the Korean word for character?
인격 is the best one.
Okay.
What I do or what I am.
Yeah, and the type of person I am. So, it's not just what acts I do lead to certain consequences. So do I fear God? That would be part of my character. And of course that has to show itself in the way I act. But it's far more than just what I do and then certain things follow. It's the whole, my character, what type of person am I? How do I live? Do I care for? Am I a caring person? Am I a courageous person? Am I a loving person? Am I a person who fears God? That would be character.
So you mean there are many types of wisdom in the book of Job, and they are character consequence beyond like character consequence beyond.
Yeah. So I think maybe can I use the board?
Oh, sure.
It's I think in a way what we're arguing is that wisdom is like a diamond, multifaceted with many facets. Okay, so you've got Proverbs, and you have Job and Ecclesiastes. Okay, and I think the question that we're asking is, if we were to sort of dig below these three books, what is the shape of wisdom? What does wisdom look like? How do we develop a concept of wisdom? Okay, and I think that's a very good question. And I think you would need to take all three books into account. And I think what I'm trying to argue is that if you want a concept of wisdom, then probably the most important book is Proverbs. Okay, I think Proverbs it tells you the ABCs of wisdom. What is that in Korean?
ABC.
I thought you had a different alphabet. So, see, I think Proverbs, especially chapters 1 to 9, it sets out the ABCs of wisdom. Then, from chapter 9 onwards, you get a much more subtle, nuanced picture with the exceptions. And that's where these things about being poor and wise and other things come in. So the book of Proverbs, I think, needs to be read as a book with an introduction, then 1 to 9, finishing with the two houses, Lady Wisdom, Lady Folly, And then it goes on to individual proverbs, and especially an author whose work you should read is, if you don't know about this author, his work is very helpful. Ray Van Leeuwen. He's written an article on poverty and wealth in Proverbs, and he shows how the picture is much more, it's a very nuanced picture when you read Proverbs in its totality. Okay, so, and he has also written a commentary on Proverbs in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. Ray Van Leeuwen, one of the best scholars of wisdom. So I think Proverbs is very important. Now, you may have to translate at this point. Do you know what Jews call midrash? You've heard of midrash, okay. And I was wondering when I was listening to the professor tell you what I was saying, if he was also doing some midrash. Now, of course, I can't understand what he's saying. But I think, what he's doing is he's taking my talk and he's contextualizing it for you, which is exactly what I need. Okay, and see, I think what Job does is it picks up on part of Proverbs. Now, it's a part that is already in Proverbs, and then it gives a midrash, an extended commentary on what that part of wisdom looks like. And I think Ecclesiastes picks up on another part that is already in Proverbs, but it's not expanded. And then it gives an extended midrash on that part of wisdom. Okay? And so, really, so what it then starts to show us is that wisdom is like a diamond. It's a complex, multifaceted, beautiful thing. Okay? And, so I think that that's a way to start to think. And then, of course, we can ask, okay, how should we think about wisdom as a whole? And I think character consequence would be part of it. I think we would say things like fear of the Lord is the starting point of wisdom. That's a very, very big issue. Okay, see, and in my reading, one of the big things Ecclesiastes deals with is what happens to you if you try and seek knowledge and wisdom without starting with the fear of the Lord. You continually end up Hevel Hevelim, Hekol Hevel. So I think these three books are very interesting. And so, to say their relationship is a crisis, it seems to me so unhelpful. Because it's so much richer. It's a very interesting relationship going on here. So I think when I hear your questions, I like them very much. And I think you are really hitting on them. And I would encourage you to keep pursuing those questions so you come to a rich articulation of what is wisdom. Yeah. So very good. Very good.
Actor consequence보다도 캐릭터 consequence가 성경 지혜서를 설명을 하는 데 있어서 더 풍부하고 깊다. Actor consequence는 너무 단순하다, simplistic하다. 그래서 이제 우리의 인격, 전인격을 회복하려고 하는 것이 이제 구약지혜에서 키운 관심이고, 그럼 이제 구약지혜의 성격을 알기 위해서는 자문과 전도서, 욥기, 셋의 관계를 알아야 된다. 다이아몬드처럼 이렇게 복합 구도를 갖고 있다. 그래서 욥기는 자문의 어떤 부분, 물론 자문 안에서도 이제 1장에서 9장하고 그리고 10장에서 31장하고 그 사이에 이제 주제의 변화, 또 성격의 변화 이런 것들이 이제 나타나고 있습니다. 그래서 욥기는 전통지의 핵심 파트 가운데 뉘앙스되고 또 새로운 영역, 전통지에게 설명하지 못하는 이 영역, 이것을 이제 설명을 하기 때문에 in a sense we can summarize the nature of the book of Job as an extended midrash of the book of Proverbs.
Part of the book of
그래서 확대된 미drash, 욥기의 잠언의 일부, 잠언 한 부분의 부분에 대해서 더 확대해서 이야기하고 풀어가고 해설해가는 이런 것을 보았습니다. 이렇게 참 멋있는 답변이 나왔습니다. Shall we go into the second question?
In your conclusion,
You know the second question.
But it's worth to repeat it. I was write it down.
you said power has violence came from psychological music. Yeah. And
Probably is not good at the psychological music.
There's
violence,
far less.
violence
Okay,
came
yeah.
from psychological music. And power is not narrative,
Yeah.
although it contains
Change
narratives,
narratives, yeah.
right? And if so, may I ask how different narrative is from narratives in Job and Ecclesiastes?
How different narrative is in Job
From narratives,
narratives compared?
like proper.
Yeah, okay. So I think, if I've understood the question, okay, so you know this French word is the word genre.
Yes.
So I think that's the question that. Thank you. As I said, 감사합니다. So I think that's the question that one needs to wrestle with. You know, if you don't know the type of literature you're dealing with, you'll ask the wrong questions when you're trying to read it. Okay? So I think if you look at the book of Job, it seems to me Job is very clearly a narrative.
Clearly,
Yeah, and
poetry.
sorry?
Poetry.
Yeah, but the poetry is subordinate to the narrative.
Really?
Do you not think so?
I don't think so.
No, it's good. This is, I cannot tell you, this is exactly what should happen. You mustn't just accept what the professor says, even the visiting professor. Because this is when the dialogue begins. But, so let me tell you why I think. I mean, I think your point is very interesting. There is so much poetry, okay? But I still think the framework of Job is the framework of narrative, and that the poetry fits within that framework. Okay, so I think if you were to explain the book of Job to someone, you would tell a story. So you would say, you know, there was this man called Job, very wise, wealthy, and so that's how you would tell the story. And then there's a plot that unfolds. I mean, that's what happens in narrative. Something has to happen. So something terrible goes wrong. So there's something goes wrong. And he loses his children. And he loses all his wealth. And then he loses his health. And then his wife says to him, Mrs. Job doesn't come off well in the book, you know. She says to him, curse God and die. It's a story. It's a story. And then Job,
Frames is just narrative.
There is a narrative frame in the
Yes,
book of Job.
prologue and epilogue is narrative. But the text almost text is poetry, I think.
Yes, yes, but the poetry, so the poetry emerges out of the narrative. So Job is now in a terrible position. So then 3 friends come. And then most of the book is about the discussions that the 3 friends have with Job. So that's where you are right. The big center of the book, it's as though the pause button is pressed and the story slows down. And then you have these long theological discussions from the friends.
So you mean story is narrative, isn't it?
Yes, yes. I think, you know, in English, you just have to be careful because sometimes when you say story, people think not history. Whereas a lot of the Bible is story and history. Okay, so, but with Job, that's a different question. But here, story equals narrative. So what I'm arguing is Job is a story. Now within that story, there's very long theological speeches, which are so long that they almost undermine its character as story. So I think that's where your point is very good. But even after the speeches, the story continues. So Job has an encounter with God, and then Job's his fortunes are restored, and he has more children. So you know, I think there's a story framework to Job that needs to be taken very seriously. But within that framework, there's these incredibly long poetic speeches. So both of those, so genre would have to include both of those elements, I think. And my point is, you cannot understand those speeches if you take them out of the story framework.
Well, I think poetry is more powerful rather than story.
Why? That's a good question. Yeah.
Job's speech is more powerful to us in the book of Job, and Job's friend's speech is more contributive to us.
Yeah, okay. I think I would be cautious as a philosopher of saying that poetry is more powerful than story. I think it all depends what you are talking about. So, you know, I grew up in South Africa. Now, if you asked me to tell you about South Africa, I would tell you about a novel that a man wrote who lived very near to where I grew up. And I think that story helps you to understand the heartbeat of South Africa much better than a reference book. Okay, but I think you're right. So I think there's certain things poetry can do that story can't do. And I think there are things that story can do that poetry can't do. But I do think for suffering, poetry can be an incredibly powerful medium. So I forget the name of, there's a Jewish author who survived the Nazi concentration camps. And he writes poetry to evoke, and see, the poetry can get at this. So he, in one of his poems, he says, "There is nothing sadder than a train which leaves on time." Okay. Now, so there's poetry getting the sheer horror of being on the train that is going to Auschwitz, and it leaves on time. Okay, but see, then I would say to you, I don't know if you know the novel by Elie Wiesel. Is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was a teenager, he survived it. He wrote this extraordinary novel, narrative story called Night. And he uses narrative to evoke the horror of what happened. So there's narrative and poetry both being used. So I'm a bit cautious on saying the one is better than the other. But what I do want to say is if you want to talk about suffering, systematic theology may not be the best way. You need literature, you need narrative, you need story, you need poetry. And then we start to feel this stuff in our bones. And see, you don't say Kierkegaard, you don't hear Kierkegaard saying, I love the Westminster Catechism. I take it to bed with me at night and I put it on my heart. What he says is, with Job, he says, I can't live without Job. So I think that's what story and poetry can do. But see, I think what I like so much is, I think you are asking the right questions. And you've no idea how important that is. As a professor in Canada, I work constantly to try and get my students to ask the questions. Because most of them just want the answers from the professor. They don't want to learn how to ask the questions. And when you're doing research, you cannot keep working like that. You've got to push the questions, ask the questions, and then your research starts to open up and develop. So I love